Access granted.
The older I get, the more I find myself appreciating older games, and I don't know, maybe it's like the cynic in me coming out and getting more prominent with age, but I just find that nowadays the most fun I have is when I'm going back and playing something from like the mid-90s. And as a kid, one of the platforms I really missed out on was the Sega Saturn, which was probably also due to the fact that it ended up performing the way it did over here commercially. In fact, I only knew one kid in school who even had one, and even then, he only had a handful of games to begin with. It was a console primarily known for a few things. Firstly, in just how much it excelled in that 2D space, featuring games with absolutely gorgeous pixel art, with all the many shoot-'em-up titles, along with the abundance of fighting games. Secondly, it also had some of the best arcade ports at the time, with stuff like Virtua Fighter, Sega Rally, and Daytona USA.
Better run home to mama now.
Then thirdly, with it being kind of interesting in the way that Japan arguably kept all the best stuff for themselves, which is again probably another reason as to why it performs so poorly in the West. What you don't hear people talking about all that much, however, are all of its first-person shooters. And since I've done a whole bunch of these videos now, focusing on all the FPS games for a single platform, I figured since it's coming up on 30 years since the Saturn first launched, that now would be the perfect time. Before I start though, do keep in mind that for some of these so-called first-person shooters, there's really not that much to say. Like this one for instance, DEFCON 5, I wouldn't even call this a shooter. It's a walking down empty corridor simulator, combined with spending time in a Windows 3.1 era interface as you interact with this confusing computer system. Well, this one, Tunnel B1, which again, I don't think even qualifies as an FPS. Either way though, while I might not touch on every single shooter on the platform, according to Wikipedia's definition of the genre, there's still far more than enough to talk about here as it is. So yeah, let's get right into it, bitch. But before I get too far into things, I do have to thank Redmagic for sponsoring this video. These guys have just recently released their new Astra gaming tablet, the ultimate portable powerhouse, engineered for those after exceptional performance, immersive visuals, and most importantly, mobility.
Mission clear.
Coming with a vivid OLED display offering up richer colours and deeper blacks, not to mention ultra-fast response times, making it great for gaming, streaming, or creative work with overall better contrast and energy efficiency. Target down! Speaking of energy efficiency, the Astra also houses a massive 8200 mAh battery, which is the largest in this class of tablets, giving you great endurance across different scenarios. For instance, like you're getting about 5 hours total of uninterrupted gaming or up to 33 hours of continuous movie playback. Sound-wise, there's dual 1620 stereo speakers with high fidelity audio, really offering up a rich, dynamic soundscape to elevate the experience. Plus you got a front and rear camera, USB-C connectivity, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, not to mention a display port output. And actually getting your hands on games to begin with is super easy too, thanks to this inbuilt game space mode, allowing you quick access to all your apps and recordings. All of this contained within a sleek, transparent metal body, dynamic RGB lighting, and powered by their top-tier Snapdragon 8 Elite chipset. I mean, this thing really does define what a gaming tablet ought to be. So to find out how you can get your hands on one of these bad boys, or just for more information, be sure to click the link in the video description. And yeah, once again, thanks to Redmagic for sponsoring this video.
Done and dusted, old-timer!
First up, we've got what's easily one of the best shooters made for the platform, and arguably one of the better shooters to come out of the mid-90s with Alien Trilogy.
I'll tell you what I know.
Developed by Probe Entertainment, it basically combined all those 3 original films into one campaign, putting the player in control of Ellen Ripley herself with 3 episodes that all featured visual motifs from the movies.
What exactly are we dealing with here?
So you got the first episode that's set on LV-426 from Aliens. The second one is set inside a prison similar to Fury 161, very reminiscent of Alien 3. And then the final episode is on a bone ship, similar to the one from Alien, with the final level for each episode also ending in a boss fight against the Queen. And it also bringing back familiar looking enemies like the standard Xeno drones, the runners and alien handlers, along with face huggers. Lots and lots of face huggers.
Looks like love at first sight to me.
The opening cinematic loosely recreates that similar scene from Aliens, with Ripley and a new squad of Marines returning to that Weyland-Yutani base, before very quickly getting attacked and overwhelmed by Xenos, with Ripley being the only survivor. And in typical 90s FPS fashion, it's just you all by your lonesome against the entire world. Weapons include a pistol, shotgun, and a flamethrower, along with the absolutely iconic pulse rifle and smart gun. With each level then being more or less its own mission, where you always got different objectives you need to complete, be it recovering ID tags from colonists, closing steam valves, or just killing all the hostiles. Along with every 3rd or 4th level usually being a rearming stage where you got a bit of a time limit and you have to run around a smaller map trying to pick up as many supplies as possible. And overall it does a bang up job of capturing the feel, the tone and look of the movies, really being a great early example of first person horror. And it really might seem kind of funny to say it now, but along with the original Doom, this is really one of those very early video games to give me full on nightmares. That limited draw distance that plagued so many games back then actually works in its favour here, preventing you from seeing all that far ahead, and really making the sight of an enemy coming out of the darkness that much more frightening. Along with the constant beeping of your motion tracker as it's picking up nearby hostiles, really keeping you paranoid and always on edge. It was also one of the first games I can remember playing that lets you destroy the environment, with some of the walls in certain areas being weak and able to be removed with explosives. But the best thing about it now, looking back, was all of the cinematics, which for the time were absolutely amazing, with these fully advanced and motion captured animations.
Run a bypass.
Good luck, Ripley.
Accessing computer system. Security codes.
Now, I've mentioned in other videos how this was the first game we got with our PS1 all those years ago, which I then went on to play to death. As for the Saturn version, however, which is what all this footage is taken from, playing through it for this video, I'll admit, was a first-time experience. And in all honesty, while there might be some minor differences between both of these in terms of the frame rate and visual clarity, otherwise they really are both neck and neck. At least, outside of some horrendous slowdown on the Saturn. Where they do objectively differ, however, is in the way that glass is rendered, which is more of a Saturn issue than anything else, due to the console apparently having different architecture to the PS1, which made it harder for it to deal with these transparency effects. But apart from that, they both still control pretty well, with the L and R button on the Saturn controller perfect for strafing and everything else mapped to suitable buttons. So really, if you played either version, you more or less got the same experience. And while I do admit that a big part of it might be the nostalgia talk, and I really do still think this thing has aged pretty damn well, it's still just a great, spooky, licensed game that manages to get the blood pumping and put a tingle on the back of your neck and balls.
That's tight. That's beautiful. That's nice. What's that?
Next up is one of the most bizarre shooters on the platform, which also unfortunately happens to be one of the very few FPS exclusives, which means we have to talk about it. And that's the video game adaptation for Congo the Movie, The Lost City of Xin. Although as far as I can tell, the only similarities this has to the movie is that they're both set in the Congo. Only instead of it being about this group of people going on an expedition, it's instead about you playing as some middle-aged, out-of-shape looking dude who seems incredibly out of his element.
He's back.
With each level of the game throwing dozens of enemies in your face while giving you a whole bunch of different objectives you need to complete. The first level, for instance, has you trying to find an antidote because apparently you've been poisoned, and here you're going to be taking on dozens of giant spiders, mosquitoes, and totem poles.
The fuck is that?
For the next level, you've simply got to find your way to the exit, which sounds simple enough, only this time you're dealing with these invisible lizard things which are able to camouflage themselves and pretty much vanish. Yeah, luckily you also find the shotgun here. Followed by the third level where you're again just trying to navigate through the same looking bushy corridors over and over, now shooting droves of what looks like silverback gorillas with this newly found machine gun. It's the fourth level though that is absolutely the worst, where you're poisoned yet again and now have to find multiple antidotes. And this shit is the worst by far, man, simply because every time you're poisoned, it inverts the controls. You know what I mean? Up is down, right is left.
Up was down, black was white, good was bad, day was nice. Yes!
And all you can really do here is just stand still and wait for the whole thing to subside. It stinks.
It stinks. It stinks. It stinks.
Throughout each stage, there's also diamonds hidden all over the place, and if you can find all of these, you get an end-of-level ammo bonus. Honestly though, I just couldn't be buggered doing any of that, and I just wanted to make the whole thing end as soon as possible. I will say one thing though, in that it is kind of impossible to ever get lost here, given just how detailed that map screen actually is, along with these helpful little lines on your minimap which lets you know where you've already been. But even still, like, it can't help the fact that everything just kind of meshes together, and every level is just the same looking bushes and trees copy-pasted over and over. But what really made me stop playing though was during the fifth level, where they introduced this awful gimmick of these constant landslides or earthquakes or something, where the entire area shakes up and down. And the visual of this thing alone was enough to make me dry heave. I mean, it made me sick. Though I did think at least these weird flying bat monkeys were certainly creative, and these things, which, I don't know, I guess are supposed to be two-headed snakes? I was going to say that I hope whoever thought up this stuff has lost their job, but in reality, everyone who worked on this game lost their job pretty soon after, considering this was the last game these devs ever made. Which makes sense, given that this is easily one of the worst shooters ever made for the Saturn. Even by 1996 console standards, man, it is bad. Especially considering stuff like Powerslave came out that same year. So ultimately what we've got here is a bad game based off a bad movie. And yeah, no surprise, it ends up being exactly what you'd expect. Sadly too, things don't really get any better with the next game in the video, the infamous Saturn port for Doom, developed by Rage Software. Ironic, really one of the worst ways to play one of gaming's most innovative and influential titles. And at this point, do I really need to even go over what Doom's all about? I mean, even my going on elderly parents could give a pretty accurate assessment of what the whole thing's about. Given how much these games have changed so much in recent years though, it is at least fun looking back at stuff like this, from a time when the series was a lot simpler, where you just played as a lone marine going up against zombies and demons as you blasted your way through dozens of different levels, all with some of gaming's most iconic weapons. There was no UAC corruption, no makers, no night sentinels, no prophecies or any of that stuff, just one man against an insurmountable force of evil. And it was good. It was damn good. And truthfully, all of that stuff is still intact here with this version, not only coming with Doom 1, but also almost the entirety of Doom 2, which is why you see things like chain gunners and revenants in that first episode. The only issue is that this Saturn version looks and runs like complete shit. Now this port is apparently based off the excellent PS1 port. The only problem is that it lacks all the stuff that made that version so interesting, with certain things like the coloured lighting effects. But it goes even further with vastly worse off performance. along with blurry, pixelated visuals. And it really cannot be overstated just how crappy this thing looks and runs at times, with a frame rate that dips into the single digits.
Destroying a classic!
You've also got again the Saturn's handicap of struggling with transparency effect rearing its ugly head, which this time you'll notice with the Spectres, who, instead of looking like these invisible phantoms, just look like these highly dithered pinky demons, which they are. Said that Rage Software didn't really have all that much experience working on the Saturn, and yeah, playing it now, it's pretty obvious as to why that is. But it does also seem like some of the blame should fall on John Carmack as well, because it's also said that he was against these guys using the full capabilities of the Saturn with this whole custom rendering technique that they came up with. Because according to him, it made it feel unfaithful to the original, which is why they had to opt for a weaker method, which is now what we've ended up with. Something which even went on to affect other things as well, like a faster firing rate for the shotgun, to the point that you can stun lock the cacodemons with it. I will say that I don't hate everything though, and I do actually think it's kind of awesome in this one how you keep your weapons across each episode. Also, seeing some of those demons from Doom 2 in the first game really adds in a fresh element, making it more interesting to play through, especially if you're like me and have finished Doom more times than you've had hot dinners. The password system is also still really impressive in the way that it can somehow track all of your different stats, in regards to your health, armor, weapons, and ammo, in lieu of a proper save file. But this is still without a doubt one of the crappiest ways you can play Doom, along with the 32X and the dreaded 3DO port. There is, however, light at the end of this shit-stained tunnel, because recently someone by the name of Faffling has created a patch for that original game file, which dramatically affects performance for the better. With there being a whole bullet point list of stuff that this guy's gone in to modify to make the whole thing run this smooth. And while it's definitely not like a complete fix, where they're still being slowed down in some areas, it is overall an incredible achievement, which vastly improves that original version. Also really making me wonder just how many other games on the Saturn could possibly benefit from getting the same treatment. You know, just a bit of technical know-how and some hindsight. Is it enough to make it worthwhile to play this version though? Well, no! And I'd say that if you want the best console experience, stick to the PS1. Finally though, we're starting to get into the good shit with Duke Nukem 3D, again a game which I doubt needs any introduction.
Those alien bastards are gonna pay for shooting up my ride.
And another one that had some really interesting console versions. Namely the one for the Nintendo 64 and the PS1, with the 64 port being pretty damn awesome, including entirely new weapon sprites, along with modifying all of the levels and the content to suit that more family-friendly console. As for the PS1 port, however, well, that's really one of those just because you can doesn't mean you should kind of deals. Thankfully though, Duke 3D on the Saturn falls somewhere in between, and while it's not a complete one-for-one recreation, it still feels like Duke Nukem where it matters most.
Piece of cake.
Right, so this version of the game was actually made by Lobotomy Software, who created the amazing Powerslave, along with the less amazing port for Quake, which we'll get to soon enough. And the first thing you'll probably notice is how it doesn't even look like it's running in the build engine, which is because it isn't. It's instead running in Lobotomy's own slave driver engine. Which also means that the levels have had to be completely rebuilt and redesigned to work within the new tech, meaning you're going to see some pretty startling differences in the architecture. Like for instance, in some of the areas of Alcatraz, you'll notice they're looking a lot more bare. And then in the toxic refinery, that shrinking puzzle you've got to crawl through seems a lot bigger, to the point that it really seems like Duke could have just simply crouched through it. Along with this level also missing that spinning pylon underwater, and even having to be broken down into two sections. And then after this, like that whole shrinking puzzle in the abyss, which causes that cliff to crumble and reveal the path to the alien ship, is just gone entirely. So overall, it's a whole bunch of minor and semi-major changes which really remind you that you're playing something on a more limited engine. Even as something as small as on the launch facility map, how that explosion effect when you launch the rocket is just removed. I do find weird too is how this port has managed to keep in all of the adult content, like all of the posters, the porno movie in the theater, and then the strippers in the red light district.
Shake it, baby.
But then it oddly lacks a lot of the violence, like the blood pools left behind when you step on someone after hitting them with the shrinker.
Damn, I'm good.
Along with other weird modifications, like coming across the Devastator in the first episode.
Hail to the king, baby.
I will say though that I do like some of the remixes for the various level themes far more than I did with all that techno trash we got in the PS1 version. And on that note as well, the Saturn version absolutely runs rings around the PS1, holding a much steadier frame rate pretty much the entire time, keeping things very playable, even during moments where a whole lot of crazy shit's going on at once. Yeah, just make sure you're playing the NTSC version and not the PAL one, because this is one of those other instances where the PAL version runs at 50 Hz, as opposed to NTSC, which runs at 60. Meaning that if you're playing the PAL version, you're playing it at what's more or less 15% slower than its overseas counterpart. And while that might not sound like such a huge amount, it absolutely is in a faster paced shooter like this.
Come get some.
So overall, this is a pretty damn solid port and a great version of one of the best FPS games ever made, really making it one of the best shooters on the Saturn, especially by 1996 console standards. So yeah, dog, hail to the king.
Die, you son of a bitch.
Next up is another one of the few exclusives for the Saturn, and that's with Ghen War, released in 1995 and developed by Jumping Jack Software. With this one having a main menu theme that I really thought sounded a hell of a lot like the opening riff from the Macarena. It's also one of the best examples of the overuse of FMV we got back in the mid-90s, with this game just being rife with these poorly acted and over-scripted cutscenes, featuring people wearing cheap costumes and looking like it was all filmed on a crappy set on a soundstage somewhere, with this super long intro cinematic here that goes for well over 5 minutes. And I'm not saying that long cinematics are a bad thing, but look man, like there's absolutely a time and a place for this stuff. And I just don't think that 90s kids really gave two shits about any of this stuff. Especially considering like most people playing games at that point in the 1990s were children.
Sir, Pavonis Mons is an inactive volcano.
And?
See, nobody cares.
Anyway, after all of this crap is over, you finally get into the game and start that first mission, only for it to all look like this. Yeah, you notice anything? Well, how about the insanely short draw distance, which prevents you seeing from more than a few feet ahead. For the second mission, you're inside these underground tunnels where you'd think it might be better, only in reality it's even worse. And that's really the consistent problem that Ghen War has. It's just this super limited draw distance with almost every single mission in the game. Obviously stemming from the limited capabilities of the Saturn, juxtaposed with the scope of all of these missions being set in these large opened up environments. As for the actual game itself, well, the premise is that it's set somewhere in the future where humans have made contact with a supposedly peaceful alien species called the Ghen. During the game's intro, the Ghen suddenly turn hostile though and start attacking this research team in space, which the player happens to be a member of.
I'm picking up phase shift anomalies in the canyon. They must be using a strontium reactor of some kind.
What do you like, fry fish in that or something?
So you put on what's basically the power loader from Aliens, if that thing ever came equipped with heat-seeking missiles, and then decide to fight back. With the twist then being that all the way back on Earth, humans are under the impression that the Ghen are still peaceful, and the player's actions are seen as this lone attack.
Well, looks like we won't be going home anytime soon.
And yeah, like that might be kinda neat, but it doesn't change the fact that the game still looks like you're watching a colonoscopy play out in real time, with it otherwise controlling like a standard first-person shooter, even including a very useful ability to do a quick 180-degree spin, which is honestly something that every FPS game should have. Mission objectives include things like destroying alien structures or just eliminating all the Ghen in the area, but it's all just so visually boring to look at, assuming you can see bugger all to begin with given how dark it is. Even those few missions that are actually set inside interior areas are still darker than Satan's butthole, with them being in these pitch black rooms and often forcing you to turn on the power to begin with. You've got missions set on Mars, Deimos, and even the Moon, and you'd think at least one of these would actually be bright, but all of them are just super dingy and hard on the eyes. Now compare all of this to something like Disruptor on the PS1, which had a very similar theme and also a similar draw distance, but somehow managed to find a way to balance out all those technical limitations by including a bunch of different backdrops for the player to explore and hiding those limits behind the architecture. I will give this thing props though, in that yet again the map and the radar is at least super helpful in helping you find your way. And in fact, it was around this point that I started to notice how similar the whole thing looked to Congo, which as it turns out is because this game was made by the same devs.
Oh fuck.
Coming out a few years before it, which I guess in some ways makes Ghen War the prototype, which then means that Congo was their magnum opus. Yeah, yikes. What is without a doubt the weirdest mechanic though is how the saves work. Right, so the way it works is that you can save your game at the end of any mission, but if at any point you lose all of your lives, of which you start out with 2, that save file is wiped and you have to start all the way back from the beginning.
What? No.
Oh yeah, and you can't even quit out of a mission early either, and you have to finish them in one go, otherwise that'll also use up one of your lives. Okay. If I can praise one other thing though, at least it's the music, which I gotta say is surprisingly good. Also being a really early example of an actual dynamic soundtrack. That being where the music actually changes depending on whether or not you're in combat. With some of those more atmospheric tracks when you're exploring these barren planets being downright eerie. Almost sounding like something out of Doom or Quake. So yeah, like it's not all bad. And I do know as well that this game had flight stick support, so I don't know, maybe on some level if you somehow had one of those things, there could be a lot more fun to be had here as well. But playing it now as just a standard FPS, it's really just kinda boring, and it looks like shit. I said it looks like shit.
It does look like shit.
And this game, along with Congo, was critically panned, which is probably responsible for why that studio eventually shut down.
Now does anyone get the feeling like we don't belong here?
You know, if the unfortunate premise of having to develop exclusives for one of Sega's worst-selling consoles wasn't bad enough to begin with. Yeah, not ideal.
My servants can smell your blood, human.
On the subject of not ideal, we've got Probe Entertainment's Saturn port for Hexen, and yeah, the years stop coming and they don't stop coming. Because yet again, this is another super shoddy port of an otherwise fantastic game. Because I really do think that Hexen is one of the most underappreciated shooters of the 1990s. And as a sequel to Heretic, it really expanded upon the gameplay and the level design in some creative ways. For starters, you now had 3 characters to choose from, with the Fighter, Cleric, and Mage, with each of them having different stats and also their own unique weapons. The level-to-level structure of Heretic was now replaced with different chapters, all connected by a central hub, where you'd keep revisiting different maps as you found key items and flipped off various switches, with it also getting really confusing at times, with a switch on one map often affecting something on a completely separate one, making it hard to track. All of which was by design, and all of which was a walk in the park compared to what they did with Hexen 2. Which is also probably why this thing has filtered so many people, despite it really being an objectively better game than Heretic was. Either way, there were a few ports made for this thing throughout the years, with there being versions for the Nintendo 64, the PlayStation 1, and then finally the Saturn. With the N64 version hands down being the best, the PS1 version hands down the worst, and then this one on the Saturn, again sitting somewhere in between. With this one actually being based off the PS1 port, having again this whole unique intro cinematic setting up all the events in the game, which is something the PC lacked, where the narrator keeps referring to the world itself as being called Hexen, when in reality it's set in the realm of Kronos.
Hexen, a world where magic's legacy has spawned corruption.
Wrong!
What it also shares in common with the PS1 port, however, is the performance. And yeah, I know I'm going to be sounding like a bit of a broken record here, but this is another one of those instances where the whole thing just keeps dropping down into single-digit frame rates, as if it's like some kind of a competition or something. To the point that it really is borderline unplayable at times. There was even a bit where it got down to 5 frames a second, which is only 4 away from it being a literal slideshow. The audio also sounds pretty bad, and the music tracks just come across as far less atmospheric, kind of ruining the score that original had. And also, much like the N64 and the PS1 port, the save files for this thing are humongous.
Humongous.
Humongous what?
Almost taking up an entire save cart with one file. There is a password system here, only the password begins you at the start of the current hub, which really isn't going to be that useful considering these hubs can go on for literally hours. I do think if nothing else, it does at least control and play okay, and the layout of the Saturn controller does work well in tandem with these kind of shooters, so on a positive note, it's like I never found myself fumbling around to get things done. But this is definitely another one of those instances where I'd really be keen to see if someone could go back in there and bugger around with the code to make the whole thing run a bit better, kind of like what they did with Doom. Even though in reality none of that's really needed, considering it's been more than playable on PC for almost 3 decades now, with any of the dozens of source ports readily available. Either way though, I'm sure that ports like this sure didn't help Hexen's reputation back in the 90s, and it's a damn shame because it really makes a laughingstock of what's truly one of the top tier titles from that era. I mean, there's villages in Burma that have been treated better than this game. Now I know that the next one isn't exactly a first-person shooter per se, but it is a rail shooter which, if nothing else, still has shooter in the description. Plus I knew that if I didn't talk about this one, there'd probably be a whole bunch of people bringing that up in the comments section. But more than that though, like, can we really afford to not talk about it? I mean, it's easily one of the most entertaining titles on the platform. I'm talking about, of course, the Saturn version for House of the Dead, a port of one of the all-time most classic arcade shooters, developed by Sega AM1, who really just owned that whole market back then in the mid-90s.
Thank you.
Titles like Virtua Fighter, Virtua Cop, and of course, Daytona motherfucking USA. Anyway, as for House of the Dead, well, it's a game where you and a buddy go into a mysterious mansion, shooting 7 shades of shit out of a bunch of zombies and other horrific monsters. Playing as either Thomas Rogan or his buddy simply named G, working for a government agency and trying to stop the evil Dr. Curian from unleashing an army of the undead. But if the mountain of sequels aren't any kind of giveaway, yeah, these guys obviously don't succeed. And along with the original Resident Evil, it's often regarded as being one of the main reasons why zombies became popular again in the 90s, and then for that popularity lingering throughout the next couple of decades. And it's not hard to see why that was the case. I mean, this thing is a non-stop rollercoaster ride of a pastiche of horror cliches, as you take on different kinds of zombies, swamp things, giant bats, demonic dogs, and gargoyles. The violence also being top-notch stuff, as you can shoot literal chunks out of the enemies, with headshots doing the most damage.
Thank you.
Along with each level ending in a unique boss fight before the final stage, really making sure it got the most money out of the player with one final boss rush. And overall, like, it wasn't exactly a super deep gameplay loop, but the advent of all these various paths throughout the stages, dependent on your actions or lack thereof, at least made it interesting to replay. Now if you play House of the Dead, well, one of 2 things is bound to happen. Firstly, that you're going to have that soundbite of the game telling you to reload burned into your ears / brain. And secondly, speaking of burning, that your retinas are going to be lit up due to the constant flashing on the screen from all that gunfire. Yeah, I always thought it was kind of funny how they were so concerned about hiding the violence from us with this game in Australia, but then they didn't even care whether or not this game gave people epileptic fits. But then having said that, one of the main things this Saturn port changes is that the screen flash is gone, making it far less likely to induce seizures. That is assuming, of course, you're playing with a controller, as using a controller bypasses the need for that screen flash, which is otherwise detecting where someone's aiming with a light gun. Otherwise, this is more or less the same as the arcade, just with a hefty downgrade in terms of the visuals, mostly in regards to the level geometry, the textures, and the lighting, which is obviously due to it having to run on a much more limited system. All of which was in the same vein as the PC port, just with the main difference being that the Saturn struggles far more with a really crappy frame rate in some of the areas. Blood is also green by default as well, which is a bit odd, and the only way to change it back to red is through a cheat menu, which I don't think most people would even know how to access. But the biggest problem you got with this version is that for most people, you're gonna be forced to use the controller, and it just flat out wasn't designed with a controller in mind, which really makes the game a lot trickier than it's supposed to be at times. I mean, that second boss, for instance, is just fucking impossible. And even with the game on the easiest setting and the continues maxed out, my wife and I couldn't even beat this thing in a single sitting. What's also kind of weird is that it doesn't support the Saturn's mouse, which is doubly odd considering Virtua Cop 1 and 2 did, games which came out before House of the Dead. Which means that your best option is to use a light gun if you can be buggered getting your hands on one, and also setting up a CRT to actually play it with.
I don't care.
Yeah, shit, I don't care either.
The other inclusion this port has is a brand new aptly named Saturn mode, where you can choose from different characters to play as. We've all got their own stats for gun damage, reload time, and hit points. And yeah, like while that might seem cool, you're really still just playing the same base game without any other major changes, so it's not really going to hold your attention all that long. Still though, for the short time it lasts, I gotta say this port is still a hell of a lot of fun. And in fact, the only person I knew in school who had a Sega Saturn at the time, this was one of the only games they had. And yeah, we sure did spend a lot of afternoons blasting through this thing after school. If you wanted to see a really good House of the Dead port though, well, then check out House of the Dead 2 on the Dreamcast, or even better than that, the version on the Nintendo Wii, which still might be the most arcade-accurate port yet. Either way, I've done my part, and I've mentioned House of the Dead. Up next is another interesting one, with another game that was never released outside of Japan. Also something I'm not even going to try to pronounce in Japanese, but one that translates to Gundam Side Story in English. And yeah, off the back of that, obviously too, considering I don't speak the language, I have no fucking idea what's actually going on here. But according to what info I could find on the internet, the gist is that you're playing as one of the members of Dingo Team, again ironic, in a story that runs alongside the events in the original anime, with the backdrop of something called the 1 Year War, which, using all of my analytical skills, would appear to be a war that lasted no less than 12 months.
No shit.
All up, there's 3 side stories in total. You've got Blue Death, Duel in the Desert, and then United Front. Not to be confused with Call of Duty United Fronts, with there then being about 5 missions in each story, where it always drops you into these large opened up areas with a bunch of enemy units to destroy. Throwing the occasional boss fight or fights, and that's about all the ingredients you've got in this Gundam side story pie. For weapons, you've got either a machine gun or cannon, along with a grenade and missile launcher, all of which you have to use in tandem with a lock-on system. And when I say you have to use this, I mean, I really mean it. You have to use this thing. Because those tougher pilots fly all over the place at such an erratic pace that it's pretty much impossible to keep track of them otherwise. All up though, it is a pretty fun gameplay loop, it's just, it does get repetitive very quickly, considering you're really just doing the same thing over and over for each mission. The level of environmental destruction is kinda cool, and if you get close to enemies you can also melee them as well. But it never really elevates itself out of just locking on to whatever enemy you're currently focusing on, before moving on to the next one and then just repeating that process until the mission ends. Also, the control scheme is kinda backwards, with the D-pad being for strafing, and then the L and R button for turning left and right, with there being no option to seemingly change this. The other 2 episodes don't really change things up either, just copying the same formula, only now in different looking environments. The briefing screens before missions now have these little portraits to show who's talking to you at the time, but really, like, that's about the only update. and much like Ghen War supported the flat stick controller, I do know that this game supported the twin sticks, and I'm sure maybe using one of these things would have made it a much more enjoyable experience. But even with that, it's still not going to be a super long game, considering you can beat all three of these in around half an hour each. Visually, if nothing else, they do look okay for the time, I guess. But then again, considering we had titles that year like Super Mario 64, not to mention Tomb Raider, the latter which also launched on the Sega Saturn. I mean, those flat and mostly lifeless environments in Gundam can seem kind of basic in comparison. Still though, amazingly for some reason, these things are looked at as hidden gems by a lot of collectors. But unless you're into the incredibly confusing time suck that is staying up to date on Gundam lore, can't imagine why you'd bother. Alas though, we finally made it to what's easily the best first-person shooter on the Sega Saturn, with Powerslave, or Exhume, depending on which part of the country you lived in.
Oh, yeah.
The gist is you're playing as a Special Forces soldier sent into the ancient Egyptian city of Karnak, which has come under attack by aliens who are trying to resurrect King Ramses and use his power to somehow take over the planet.
They're draining the power from it to use as their own.
So you're obviously dropped into the city alone and have to stop them. And it's a cool mix of Doom meets Egyptian mythology that really hadn't ever been done before, almost also feeling part Indiana Jones at times, with the player having to explore all these tombs and temples and dodge countless booby traps along the way.
Booby traps? Oh yes.
With a roster of guns that really goes for quality over quantity, with a sword, pistol, machine gun and flamethrower among a bunch of others. But what's most interesting about Powerslave is how much it differs depending on which version or platform you're playing. If you're on the PC, for instance, it's really just a standard first-person shooter, running on the build engine where you go key hunting from one level after the other, with the occasional boss fight thrown in there to mix things up. But on the consoles with the PS1 and the Saturn, it's instead a Metroidvania Lite, where you access different levels through a map screen, and go back to revisit old stages to reach new areas once you've found various upgrades. These take the form of different relics, like a pair of sandals that makes you jump higher, you got a mask to let you breathe underwater, and a shawl so you can drop safely from any height. And you're frequently going back to all these old levels, unlocking new exits you couldn't get to before, really making it feel far more in-depth than just searching for that end-level switch. Even certain walls could be destroyed with a grenade once you'd found it to uncover extra hidden paths. And then finally, you could also collect the pieces of a transmitter which would further unlock the good ending. All topped off with a great art style and some gorgeous pixel art, which truly had some pretty damn gruesome kills. Along with what's still one of the best soundtracks in any first-person shooter. So yeah, dog, even in 2025, this thing is still really fun to play. And it's kind of crazy how well even some of the more archaic elements like the platforming hold up. It's not all perfect though, and there is quite a lot of old school bullshit here and there. As an example, some of the levels are kinda dog shit, like this whole sunken temple for instance, where you're constantly racing back to the surface to top up your air supply. Plus, there's no mid-mission checkpoints either, so if you die during any of these, it's all the way back to the beginning of the current level. The console version also lacks the fixed ammo and health pickups from the PC, replacing it instead with these randomized health or ammo power-ups that drop from enemies or breakables. And with this, you're pretty much at the mercy of RNG, making it really annoying for instance when you've got full health but no ammo, and yet the game just keeps dropping health power-ups instead of ammo ones. As for the Saturn version specifically compared to the PS1, well, the main differences I think can be seen in the level architecture, with certain environments being completely different and some levels from the PS1 version not even appearing on the Saturn. Like the Cavern of Peril for instance, which is what I call your mum's lady parts, which differs greatly between platforms. with the general overall difference just being that a lot of the levels on the PS1 version feel a lot smaller and claustrophobic, whereas it seems on the Saturn those environments are often bigger and more spacious. Which, yeah, is probably why the Saturn version was mostly used as the basis for the remaster. I have played the PS1 version the most throughout the years, so I kinda like to think I know that one quite well. And outside of the controller obviously having its buttons in different places, in terms of how it feels to play, both of these are more or less identical. The only main thing I notice is that those collectible anks, which extend your life and essentially give you multiple health bars, are spaced out a bit differently, making the game more challenging early on. Plus, it also does have, yet again, those similar issues when it comes to the Saturn rendering water, due again to the whole transparency handicap we've gone over multiple times. But outside of these visual differences between the two, despite which one you go with, you're still largely getting the same experience. That being what is still absolutely one of the best shooters ever made for the consoles, and also one of the few ones you can still easily play even nowadays. Considering that a few years back, Night Dive Studios remastered this with the awesome Powerslave Exhumed, an update which is based primarily on this Saturn port. And if Night Dive got their hands on it, well, that should really tell you how good it is. And yeah, what a shame it is that after a really good Lobotomy Software title, I've got to yet again talk about another dud, with their work on the Quake port. And just to start with, I will say that on a technical level, it is incredibly impressive that they got this whole thing working to begin with. Having said that though, one of the reasons I don't like this version is that this isn't really Quake in the traditional sense. It's completely built up from the ground again using the Slave driver engine, again like what they did with Duke Nukem 3D. However, whereas Duke Nukem 3D on the Saturn still felt like Duke Nukem 3D to me, this version of Quake just doesn't. Right, so much like Doom, I don't think I really need to go into any great detail over what Quake is about. It's one of those series and games that's ingrained in almost everyone's gaming DNA.
It's true.
It was really one of the first shooters to use a fully 3D engine, moving on from that whole 2.5 era we had with things like Doom in the 90s, along with introducing proper mouse look, with threats now coming from literally every single direction, all of which was a huge step forward in terms of evolution for the genre. But even if you've only played Quake for like 5 minutes, you'll still instantly notice how off this version of the game looks and feels. For starters, all of the enemies look and behave differently, and the weapon models are now 2D sprites instead of fully 3D models. You also take damage way quicker from some of the enemies as well, especially the grunts, which also might have something to do with the faster firing rate for the shotgun and the super shotgun. I mean, just compare the speed of the two of these from the original to this version. Another thing is you can only save your progress in between levels, which does start to become a bit of an issue. I mean, look, like I'm not sure if you guys know all that much about Quake's level design, but sudden death can be pretty frequent here. More so as well if you're playing the whole thing at 15 frames a second. There's also other pretty hefty level changes, with some of the maps often looking vastly different and simplified. And also a weird one I noticed, how in the second level of the first episode, the ogre is immediately hostile, whereas on the PC, this guy's completely unaware of the player. And considering a lot of Quake's appeal at the time came from its visual spectacle, as being this really foreboding, fully 3D powerhouse, when you take those visual aspects and tone them down or remove them, it does affect things quite a lot. Even just the fact that the quad damage seems to run out quicker now totally fucks up the way it's intended to be used in certain areas. But I think the worst example is during the Chthon fight at the end of the first episode, where the timing for bringing down those two electrical pylon things is just completely off. Now on the PC, this was all timed perfectly. You'd run across each of these in a single lap before then hitting the activation panel and frying this guy. Repeat that 2 more times and then he's dead. With the Saturn version though, everything moves a lot slower, and even if you hit both of the switches one after the other, you still have to wait a few seconds at that main activation panel before you can even use it, which gives this guy the necessary time for his projectiles to catch up to you. Something that also highlights how, although performance is solid most of the time, there are those instances where it becomes nigh unplayable. And that's really the worst thing this version has going for it, because Quake's not the kind of game where you want to be handicapped by low frame rates and sluggish controls. I mean, this thing is crushing and relentless at the best of times, even on the PC with a mouse and keyboard. I will admit though that some of the changes are kinda cool, like all those new lighting effects they've added in for instance, and it has still got Trent Reznor's soundtrack, which just adds so much to the overall atmosphere. So overall, like, it was a perfectly fine option if you didn't have a good PC at the time. And I can see how for a lot of people who had this as their main introduction to Quake, how they might look back on this thing kinda fondly. But nowadays, this whole thing is just completely redundant, and it easily loses out to the vastly superior PC and even the N64 version, both of which just run rings around it. Lobotomy Software were allegedly also working on a version of Quake for the PS1, but sadly, that thing never saw the light of day. So whether or not it would have been an improvement on this, I guess we'll never know. So yeah, like, this might be a great collector's item and a good pissing contest for people who like to brag about the capabilities of the Saturn, but outside of that, it has bugger all else going on for it. Bitch! At this point, we're getting into the endgame with another Japanese title, and another one I can barely pronounce that roughly translates into English as Special Riot Police J-SWAT. Not to be confused with E-SWAT on the Mega Drive. E-SWAT. Which is also another one of the very few exclusive first-person shooters made for the Saturn, having some of the most 90s looking FMV scenes you're ever gonna see, which is really just a bunch of guys in costumes running around empty rooms holding guns in completely unrealistic ways. Obviously, because this is all in Japanese, a lot like those Gundam games, I've yet again got no idea what's going on. But it seems that on some level the whole thing's set in Japan, obviously, when there's some kind of criminal organization going around distributing weapons to all these lowlifes. And I guess you're playing as one of those J-SWAT members going up against a whole bunch of these bad guys. One who looks like he's either dressed up as a Mad Max character, or someone who's going to tell you he's the boss of the gym.
Fuck you.
Along with, I don't know, Tommy Wiseau.
I did not hit her.
At the beginning of each mission, you get a short briefing showing the map and the locations of all the enemies. And you can even customize your entire loadout as well, with there being a surprisingly large roster of guns to choose from. Even though I found the best option was to let the game do this for me automatically. Then when you're in the mission, all you do is just run around shooting at people until they surrender, before they can be arrested and vanish entirely from existence, presumably sent right to the Phantom Zone. After you've arrested everybody in the area, the mission then comes to an end, and the whole thing kind of reminds me of that old PS1 shooter called Expert, which was also a Japanese-only title with a similar premise. So overall, it's definitely pretty bare bones, and the lack of any kind of weapon model or sprite also makes things really uninteresting. I mean, they could fit all this crap all over the HUD, but they couldn't include some kind of weapon model. You might also think that the automatic weapons, like the rifles and the submachine guns, would be best here, but weirdly enough, I found that the pistols are the most effective by far, with the shotgun probably being the worst. I mean, this thing has the slowest moving pellets I think I've ever seen. You could fax the bad guys and let them know you just shot at them, and they'd still be able to avoid it. Obviously, I'd also be more invested in this thing if I could actually understand what was going on, because some of these cutscenes are pretty intense with some hectic shootouts.
Woo, you know you did.
And it looks pretty cool as well how you get these fake news broadcasts at the end of each mission detailing your success. I do find it funny too how the beginning of each level shows your squad all sneaking into the mission area, trying to be super stealthy and stay undetected using hand signals and all that stuff as they move ahead, only for this one idiot to always yell out and totally give away your position. So all up, it's hardly any kind of hidden gem, but it is an interesting title simply for it being one of the few Japanese-made first-person shooters, considering that's a genre that back then, the country barely seemed to give a shit about. Still though, there's far better shooters out there.
Oh, hi, Mark.
But I don't want to leave things on a downer, so let's finish the whole thing up by talking about another one of the few good rail shooters we got for the Saturn, with Virtua Cop 1 and 2. Yeah, developed by Sega AM2, the same dudes behind House of the Dead, and this is easily one of the most influential rail shooters ever made, being something of a spiritual sequel to Lethal Enforcers and no doubt influencing everything that followed, especially with stuff like Time Crisis.
Action!
Also, I think being the first rail shooter to use fully 3D models as opposed to 2D sprites, along with having one of the most 1990 soundtrack of all time. The basic premise is you're living in some kind of a city where crime is a serious shit that needs wiping up, and you've got 3 levels to get through in different areas, with them referred to as easy, medium, and then expert. The way it works is that when enemies pop up on the screen, they then get a reticle around them, which indicates how long you've got until they attack, making it a matter of quickly trying to shoot them before they shoot you. When you ran out of bullets, you'd aim off the screen and quickly fire once to reload before then getting right back into it, with a seemingly infinite supply of spare ammo in reserve. Occasionally you'd find special weapons like an automatic pistol, a machine gun and shotgun, which offered up bigger magazine sizes and firing rates, but considering every single enemy dies in a single hit anyway, none of these are all that really game changing. More instead useful for when you just get large clusters of enemies all at once. But the real challenge in the Virtua Cop games has always been trying to not shoot all these brain-dead civilians along the way. Idiots who stupidly pop out of cover and into the line of fire like complete dickheads.
Is Bart home?
Just taking Maggie first, go!
And you'd think that it would be easy enough to avoid them, but honestly, not hitting these guys is the most challenging aspect of the game. And ironically, someone who pops out and screams, "Don't shoot me," is more often than not going to be catching a bullet with their face.
You hit that guy! He shouldn't have been standing there.
Anyway, each of the levels also ends in a boss fight. Firstly against this big dude named Kong, followed by another fight against a big dude named King. Yeah, subtle. Before finally, a fight against what's more or less the Kingpin, aptly named Boss. And about the only thing I'd point out is that the levels are all out of whack, with the so-called medium level way harder than expert is. For starters, this level easily has the highest concentration of enemies during a few key moments, but also because for the other levels, the boss fight is just you against one opponent. Whereas here on medium against King, it's against a whole bunch of enemies at once, as this guy keeps running away to send in reinforcements. Still though, it doesn't really detract from what's otherwise a pretty damn solid shooter, and on an even more positive note, this is one of the few games to use the Saturn's mouse, which, while that might not be as effective as using an actual light gun, is still far better than using a controller. The only thing that brings my piss to a boil there is how you have to press the reload button twice before it works, which is just fucking stupid. As for Virtua Cop 2, well, really, that's just more of the same, just with better looking visuals and far superior action scenes. For instance, the first level has a really cool car chase, where you're shooting at pursuing vehicles as enemies hang out of the windows, while the third level has a whole sequence set inside a moving train, where at one point you even hop out of the train and move along the top of it, firing back at a nearby chopper. Yeah, along with another car chase after that. We can even shoot out the tyres of some of these vehicles, all of which is leaps and bounds more advanced than anything we got in the first game. At certain points in the levels, you can even choose between one of 2 different routes, which then affects how the rest of the stage plays out, which in a lot of ways also might be a bit of foreshadowing to how much further they take this concept in House of the Dead. Not to mention, there's also far more interaction with the environment, with different elements now reacting to gunfire. And then instead of it just being 3 stages, there's now a 4th one, which is like a final time showdown against the main baddie named Fang, where you got to stop this guy from launching a blimp bomb. Yeah, a blimp. Like, what is this, 1926? And then once you've beaten the game for the first time, you unlock a bunch of extra options to play with, like automatic reloading or being able to select weapons from the pause menu. So much like House of the Dead, these are overall pretty good ports, even if yet again they are just based off an arcade game you're likely to beat in half an hour. And that's really the biggest downfall they all have, where you're expected to pay big bucks for something that you're only going to play for 20 or 30 minutes at a time. Like, just consider, right, that these are games quite literally designed to make you lose. I mean, arcade games are almost by their own design supposed to make you fail, which does make the experience feel a bit cheap and frustrating during those moments when the whole thing's been very clearly thrown together in a way that's meant to overwhelm you. And yeah, like, while that kind of design approach was fine in the arcade, this isn't the arcade, it's the living room. Then again, I guess complaining about an arcade game being challenging is like complaining about water being wet or grass being green. I still think the best way to play both of these, however, is that Elite Edition on the PS2, which not only packages both games together, but also offers up a pretty decent remaster as well. But if you're looking at these base games in terms of just sheer entertainment value, then yeah, they still hold up for the most part. At the end of the day, I do feel like the Saturn's FPS library also doubles as a perfect summarization for Saturn games on the whole, where it's like you got a bunch of arcade ports in there combined with those fewer exclusive titles, but none of which are really all that amazing in the grand scheme of things. And out of all the platforms I've done this format of videos for, looking at all these different FPS titles and all that, the Saturn has to be the weakest one I've done so far, which is ironic considering it's also one of Sega's most underperforming platforms as well. This was around that time when you had the N64 and the PlayStation coming out as well, which was a real turning point where games were now being made to be beaten, where you could really sit down and get engrossed in something over the course of dozens, if not hundreds of hours. Games like Metal Gear Solid, Final Fantasy VII, and Ocarina of Time. We were seeing save files and memory cards becoming far more necessary. And while I'm not acting like this wasn't also the case for earlier generations, this truly was that gen of consoles where that became cemented as the norm. And it's like, yeah, why not? If you spend 100 hours playing Final Fantasy, well, you wanted to make damn sure that your progress wasn't lost. Versus a console like the Saturn, where some of its most popular titles were things carried over from the arcades, with the many shoot-em-ups, beat-em-ups, and fighting games. Things you'd play for 20 minutes and then just be kinda done with, where all you were really saving was your high score or controller settings. Even one of the most popular exclusive titles made for the Saturn, Panzer Dragoon, was a rail shooter, a very popular genre with arcade games. And again, I'm not saying that every single game was like this, and there was undoubtedly some amazing exclusive titles designed for extended play. But if you go back and take a look at a bunch of top 10 or top 20 games of all time lists made for the Saturn's library, well, you can bet your bottom dollary do that the majority of entries on those lists are gonna be arcade ports. The Saturn was ultimately one of Sega's biggest blunders, a console that seemed primarily built for 2 dimensions at a time when the gaming world seemed intent to move into 3. And if Sega didn't even fully realise what this platform's fullest potential was, well then, what possible chance could we have?
Finish!
If nothing else though, I hope I've once again helped to shed some light on some of these lesser known FPS titles. And I still do find the Saturn to be an incredibly interesting and unique platform, even if overall it was just a bit of a drop in the ocean to what followed.